Hey guys, this is Exorcist. I'm here to make a guide on the new Huppermage Rework. Today I'm going to be going over all the spells and passives so that you guys can get a better understanding of how to play it, or at least how I understand how to play it. Now, the important thing to keep in mind here is that this class has a lot of different ways to play it. There's not just one way or, one meta way, like maybe Yop, for example. So I'm going to go over the spells first. Right now I'm just going to leave most of my spell slots and passive slots empty with the exception of things that I'm going to be showing you. So first you'll notice off that the elemental spell section has more spells than other classes. This is on purpose. Of course, they have access to all 4 elements, which is unique to Huppermage, and they also have these light elemental spells, which is a not unique element to Huppermage, but it's the only class to have these light damage spells in their elemental spell branch, generally. There might be a few exceptions outside of Huppermage, of course. So, let me go ahead and go through them, and I'll explain how these work. First of all, light damage is going to be using your highest mastery total elemental bonus. So, for example, if you look at my stats, my highest one is water. So, whenever I do light damage, it will actually apply against the target's water resistance. Now, what's nice about Huppermage is they can actually change their mastery type by going into a different heart. So let me go ahead and do that really quick. I'm going to just go ahead and put quickly one of each elemental spell so I can show you how that works. So, you start the fight, you'll see that I start out normal, no big deal. Now I'm going to cast a fire spell, just to go ahead and get a fire rune. So you'll notice that when you cast an elemental spell, if you do not have a rune, you'll actually generate that rune in that element as you go. This is why you have access to all 4 elements, is because you're able to get all 4 of these runes. Now you'll notice down here that you actually have a few extra spells on your 3rd bar. Now, every Huppermage will have these. This first one is Heart of Light. This is going to allow you to switch into the heart that you want. It's based on the last rune that you generated. So, for example, let's say my last rune generated in this case was Air. So if I go ahead and use this Heart of Light on myself, I'm going to go into the Heart of Light of Air. This is only 1 cast per turn, so you can't really switch. There is one exception, of course, if you use a certain passive, which I'll show you. You also have this spell right here called the Will-O-Wisp. You can actually take the last rune you generated and place a wisp. You see how that rune disappeared? It actually goes into the wisp, and then you can actually pick it back up by casting the spell back on the same wisp, giving me that rune back. Now these runes, you'll notice they only last 2 turns. If you look up here, you can see runes last 2 turns. So let's say, for example, I get another fire rune. I can place down that fire rune. But you can actually have more than 1 wisp at a time, as long as you have another last rune to put down. In this case, I've got 2 wisps down. Now, this is the maximum number of wisps you can have. You actually can't have more than this. So you see, if I try to place a 3rd one, it won't let me. However, I can now go ahead and get these 2 runes, and when you do this, you actually get the AP back from the wisp. So you actually recover 2 AP and the rune when you pick up the wisp. Now, one more thing you'll notice is you actually also get a spell on your 3rd bar of the element that you picked up a wisp in. So the last wisp I picked up was an earth wisp. The game gave me this earth spell off my spell deck. The reason it gave me this is because I didn't have it in my deck. So the game, they've decided that one way to reward you for picking up your wisps is to give you a spell from that element. So this allows you to get more spells out of your deck without having to necessarily place them onto your spell deck. You can see right here, I'm going to go ahead and get this spell. So this is a Mirage spell. So that's the Will-O-Wisp. Next is the Elemental Cycle spell, which is, I think, one of the more complicated spells that I think people are going to have to get used to if you're going to become a good Huppermage player. So the way this works is this will actually generate the last rune that you had if you don't have it. So let's say my last rune generated, you can see up here, is an Air rune, but I don't have the Air rune. So if I cast this on myself, I'll get an Air rune. Now, the other use of this is that if you do have the last rune you generated, for example, I have the air rune, and it's still last rune generated as air. If I cast this on myself, it will actually generate the Nemesis rune. So, the Nemesis rune to air is earth, and the Nemesis rune to water is fire. I'll show you really quick. So there's a water rune, and that puts it into fire rune. So, there's the elemental cycle. The other thing you want to keep in mind is you can actually cast this spell as much as you want, but every time you cast it, it costs more QB. See how fast I drained my QB doing that? Now, if you're wondering what QB is, this is actually you could see it as your mana, so to speak. Not every spell is going to cost QB, but many of them will. For example, Elemental Cycle. The more you cast it, the more QB it costs. And there's a few ways to actually get QB back. So for one, ending without a heart active will actually give you 100 QB back at the end of your turn. You can see that keeps going up. However, there are other ways as well. So for example, if I go into the Fire Heart, now if I end my turn, I won't get any QB at the end of my turn. See how I ended and I didn't get any QB? Well, I can go into Fire Heart because each heart has a different way to generate QB. For example, the Fire Heart actually generates QB when you attack from the maximum cell. You have to hit a target by hitting the maximum cell of the spell's range. I'm just going to do that really quick to get rid of all my QB so you can see. When I cast this at the max range, I'm going to get some QB, but if I don't cast it at the max range, I don't get any QB. Okay? Now, important to keep in mind, you can actually do this with other elemental spells too. It doesn't have to be a water spell. So, for example, the water spell, the earth spell, I'm sorry, it doesn't have to be a fire spell in this case. I can actually use any elemental spell, and it will work just fine. So let me go over each of the elements' heart generation really quick. So fire, as I explained, is casting a spell on a target that is the maximum range possible. For water, it's actually, well, I'm going to need a light spell to show you this. Let me just grab any light spell. Let's just use Twilight Beam for now. So the way the water heart works is, in order to generate QB, let me go ahead and spend my QB really quick so you can see. So, for example here, the only way to generate QB while in Water Heart is to alternate between elemental spells and light spells on targets specifically. You have to target something. So, if I hit, let's say the enemy with that, and then I hit them with Twilight Beam, you'll notice my QB goes up. But now, if I do another water spell on myself, that goes up by another 20 QB. Then I use Light Beam, and that goes up by 40. So you basically want to alternate. You can't get QB back on the first cast, but you can get QB back on every cast after that as long as you're alternating them. Now, let's see. The Earth Heart is everyone's favorite as far as I can tell. You literally just have to be next to a target and cast a spell on them, and you'll generate QB. It could literally be, as long as you're next to them, you'll always generate QB with any spell you cast. I believe that even counts non-elemental spells. For example, you might have some spells that let you target other stuff. But that only works on targeted enemies or allies adjacent to you. Now, for the last one, which I believe is everyone's least favorite, I'm going to go ahead and spend my QB really quick. Just ignore me doing that. So, everyone's least favorite as far as I can tell is this air one. So actually get QB back every time you create a movement. So, for example, this diurnal butterflies can push if I have an earth rune. Doing that will actually give me 20 QB. Now, another thing which is nice about diurnal butterflies, I actually want to point this out really quick, is that if you actually push and pull at the same time, you get twice as much QB. See that? I got 80 QB for just one spell cast. So that's each of the hearts. That's how you can generate QB over time using your heart. Each one's different. One more thing I want to point out about QB generation is that while you're in your heart, you'll actually store some QB every turn. You actually, I believe you get 75 per turn when you end in QB. So you'll actually, now that if I end my turn, I'll actually get 300 QB plus it actually gives me an extra 100, which is the natural generation. So that actually maxed out my QB generation just by ending without a heart. So now that we've got those out of the way, I know those are really complicated, but now one more thing I want to point out really quick about being in heart. If you take a look at my elemental mastery, I've actually got my highest mastery is water, but if I go ahead and get into my fire heart, you'll notice my mastery changed over to fire, and I lost the mastery in every other element. Not only that, but it actually went up by 20% as well. That's because when you're in a heart, your highest elemental mastery is increased by 20% and then copied into the element of the heart you pick. So you could actually do this in any element. For example, let's say I wanted to do air damage this turn. I would actually just go into my air heart, and now I've got 6,000 mastery in air. So that's another thing I wanted to point out about the Heart of Light. So now I'm actually going to go through each of the elements so I can show you kind of what they do as you go, as you play through them. So, for example, just for the sake of keeping my spells, my elements capable of being generated, my runes, I'm just going to keep those 4 on. But for example, for the fire spells, you got Energy Flux, which isn't great, but, you know, it's an option. You also got Luminescent Disc, which is my favorite personally, and then you've got Light of Dawn. So these effects that they give are not great, unfortunately. Yeah, you could get a little bit of extra rear damage. It's 10% DI added from behind. It's not great. So for example, if I get each one of these runes, I can do Luminescent Disc, and you'll see that this guy, I lose my runes, but this guy gets 10% extra damage suffered from behind for 2 turns, including this turn. So if I end my turn, he actually still has it for this turn. So if I hit him in the back, he would actually take even more damage. Of course, it's not that great, which is why I don't think anybody uses it. However, you also have this option for Light of Dawn, which is when you end your turn, the target will actually suffer 10% extra DI in that element that you generated. So for example, let's say or your last rune generated when you end your turn. So let's say I do like Luminescent Disc, Light of Dawn, then do that again. Now, if I end my turn, let's say my last rune generated was Earth, and I go into Earth Heart. When I end my turn, he's actually going to take 20% extra damage from Earth for this turn. And it also includes the turn after you end your turn, so your allies can also benefit from this. However, it's really not that much. I mean, 20% DI isn't much, so you'll mostly ignore that. Next, I will go on to the water spells, which, unfortunately, they're not super great either. They're not bad, I suppose. So, Walloping... So, we'll start with Downpour. Downpour is the best one. I think everyone really likes Downpour. So, what's cool about Downpour is on allies it actually heals, and on enemies it deals damage. So you can actually heal yourself with this, and you can also deal damage with it. But you'll notice that when I cast it on him, it casts on myself again too. That's because it actually copies the effect onto every target that has already been targeted by it this turn. So for example, let me go ahead and show you with multiple targets. Let's say I get 3 Mr. Punchies. So, if I end my turn, you can see I'm going to take some damage really quick. Now, what I'm going to show you is that I can cast Downpour on myself, get a little bit of health back, then I cast it on this guy, get a little bit of health back, cast it on this guy, get some health back, he takes extra damage, and then cast it on this guy, get some health back, and they both take extra damage. Now, it's got a max cast of 4 turns and 2 per target, but you can essentially see the idea here, is you can spread the Downpour onto multiple targets. Next spell is Walloping, which has pretty good base damage. I mean, it's 66, Downpour's only 52. You can see how that's better for sure. So, what it does, I mean, you know, it does some good damage, but the effect is that as long as you have a water rune, it makes the target transparent. Now, what's weird about that is, I've actually noticed this is a little bit of a bug, or is it? I'm not actually sure. No, there's no bug. Never mind. I think I confused myself. But you can see that this guy is now transparent, so I can't cast Downpour through him, but I could cast Downpour through him. This could, I guess, sometimes be useful, and again, it's only 2 times per turn, and on allies it heals. Next spell is Vestige. This spell's weird because you can only cast it on enemies, or you can actually cast it on your Wisp. Now, it doesn't do anything on your Wisp, but you actually increase the AoE size by having an air rune, and now I can hit these 3 targets all at the same time. Now, what's cool about this is it actually has the ability to increase damage inflicted of allies and decrease damage inflicted of enemies. So if I get, let's say, a fire rune and an earth rune really quick, if I cast this right here, all 3 of those enemies will now lose 10% DI for 1 turn. And of course, you could cast that on your Wisp as well. So you can see how those spells could be pretty good, especially if you decide to go for a healing build. Those 3 spells are pretty good. So next, I'm actually going to go into the Earth branch, which I think is everyone's favorite branch. I'm going to show you really quick how this works. So, there's a few different ways you can actually use the Earth branch. For example, one of my favorite ways is to literally just get an Earth rune and then cast it again. You get a little extra armor if you have an Earth rune when you cast Rift. You can actually just cycle to get it back and then cast it again and get more armor. It's a really easy way to generate up armor, so I think a lot of people will probably use it for that. The other thing is that Rock Slide actually removes AP and MP. So for example, let's say I go ahead and get all 3 of these runes, and now I cast Rock Slide on this guy. See how he just lost AP and MP? Like that's not even that bad. And now I've got 4 runes, and Backband actually removes an MP per rune possessed in an AoE. So if I do this, I actually just shred the MP off all 3 of those targets, and I can do it twice per turn. You can see I actually removed a decent amount of MP, and I don't even have that much Force of Will. So that's another thing that I think a lot of players will appreciate about this class, is that you can actually do stuff like, you know, use Rift, use Backband, use Rift again, use Backband, Rock Slide, I'm sorry, and then Backband, and, you know, I generated armor, I removed AP, I removed MP in an AoE, you know, not bad, really. The Earth Branch works really well together, and I think a lot of players like that, especially considering you can easily generate QB in the process. Next is the Air Branch. So these spells are kind of cool, I guess. It really depends on what you want to do, right? So what's cool about Diurnal Butterflies is, I already mentioned this earlier, it can push or pull. So for example, if I have a water rune, I can actually just pull with it. Or if I have an earth rune and a water rune, I can actually pull and push with it. Now you're probably wondering, when is that useful? Well, it's really only useful when you have the air heart. You can generate twice as much QB. And of course, if you have a fire rune, it doubles those effects. So he's going to get pulled into me and then pushed back into that square. You see how that worked? So there's different ways you could potentially set up your own positioning. Now another thing you can do is, using this Mirage, you can see this is actually a switching spell. It'll consume your air rune to give you more range, minimum and maximum on the spell when you cast it. So for example, I could just do all sorts of fun little tricks, moving people around using Mirage. Which I think a lot of people find this super satisfying, I think, just to have the ability to teleport stuff around and become mobile. Now, Dancing Shadows is an interesting spell because it actually could be used in any angle. So for example, I can push something back 2 cells like that, and it actually teleports them, so that could go over someone else or on a wall. But you can actually do this at an angle as well. For example, you can cast it like this, or I could cast from here to push that guy like that. So there's actually potential for this spell to be really cool. If you have exactly 2 runes, it actually pushes them even farther. It says 4 cells farther. I don't know if it's actually 4 cells. But for example, I could push him here. And that's actually a pretty good push right there. So there's the air spells. They're pretty cool. Now I'm going to talk about the light spells. So you've got 8 of them, and I'm going to go over really quick what each one is very useful for. So first one I want to start with is Resonance. This is probably my favorite light spell, personally. Resonance is actually really cool because it's got a different effect for each rune that you have. So let's say, for example, if I go into Water Rune, Resonance is actually cheaper all of a sudden. Instead of 4 AP, it's now 3 AP, but it costs 25 QB on top of the 3 AP. If I get a Fire Rune, the spell now has an even bigger AoE. See how big that AoE is? If I have an Earth Rune, it actually goes underneath their armor. So if they had armor, this spell would start going underneath that. And with an Air Rune, you can actually start casting through targets, which you couldn't do before. So if there's something blocking line of sight, you can actually start hitting through it. Whereas if I didn't have that Air Rune, now I can't cast through it. I have to cast right here. So that's cool about Resonance. Next, I'll talk about Twilight Beam. And for Twilight Beam, I'm actually going to show you with Luminescent Disc. One of my favorite combinations, Twilight Beam actually does okay damage, but if you have a Fire Rune, it does bonus damage depending on how much remaining QB you have. So if your QB bar is full, it actually does an extra 50% base damage, bringing this up to, 184-ish base damage? That's not bad. So, for example, what I really like is using the Luminescent Disc with Twilight Beam because they have the same range. If you have +0 range, then Twilight Beam is the same range as Luminescent Disc. So if you go into Fireheart, cast this, then do it again, and there you go. That's not even that bad of a combo. The damage does pretty good damage, and it actually generates QB the entire time. As you can see, I could hit from over here. I did that in the wrong order, but that's okay. Pretty good, right? So that's Twilight Beam. Next I want to show you Light Arrow. Light Arrow is really cool. I think this is kind of everyone's favorite light spell just in general for how useful it is. So it's got 4 different effects based on the last rune generated. The first one, so if you just cast it, it's normal. But if you cast it with a Fire Rune, it actually becomes this straight line AoE. You could actually hit multiple targets with it. If you get the Water Rune, that actually makes it cheaper. Brings it down to 5 AP instead of 6. Which can be useful if you just want to do pure damage. Next, you've actually got the Earth version, which removes armor. It actually removes a lot of armor, especially if you crit. This is minus 4,300 armor before dealing damage. Like that did a lot of bonus damage just because of the minus armor. And for the Air version, which is probably the most underwhelming one, but I still use it sometimes, it essentially just removes the straight line only and allows you to attack from wherever you want. So for example, I can throw my Light Arrow here. Okay, so that's a Light Arrow. It has a cooldown and costs a lot of QB, so you won't use it very often. Very important to keep in mind, Light Arrow, you can't generate QB in every heart. The 2 that you can generate QB in with Light Arrow is Fire, which you would stand as far back as possible to cast the Light Arrow. See how that gave me some QB back when I casted it. And the other one is actually Water, where what you would do is you would cast a Water spell, and then hit them with Light Arrow, and that'll generate the QB as well. So there's your 2 options for generating QB with Light Arrow. Next is Glistening Tears, which is another one of my favorites. This spell's really good for healing. Let me show you really quickly. Let's go let him take my health down. Go ahead and shred my health. Okay, one more hit. So now you can see Glistening Tears actually heals the target if they're an ally, but deals damage to enemies. Now, if you have a Water Rune, this will actually heal you, the caster, as well. So, for example, I can go ahead and get a Water Rune by casting Downpour, go into the Water Heart. Now I can cast Glistening Tears, gets rid of the Water Rune, heals me. Now I hit him with Downpour, and then I hit him with Fear again, and then one more heal, and I've actually healed myself up pretty decently, and that's without any healing passives at all. That's Glistening Tear. Really good for healing off yourself and ally. It doesn't require a line of sight, but it is straight line. Next is Moonbeam. Now this is really cool. I want to show you this. So let's say, for example, I'm trying to get a bunch of armor, right? So Moonbeam has this really cool straight line AoE. It actually reaches pretty far, too. Look at that. That's pretty far. But let's say, for example, I wanted to get some armor. So this will actually steal some of the damage you deal and convert it into armor. So, for example, I could actually get some pretty good armor just by hitting off like that. Now, this is on 50% resistance targets. But Just look at the amount of armor I was able to get. That's actually really good, for example, let's say in a rift, where the enemies don't have a lot of resistance, and you'll deal a lot of damage. Another interesting thing about this spell is that it actually has an interesting property of spreading along your... So, for example, let's say I wanted to hit all three of these enemies. I couldn't do it, right? Well, if I stand back and I put my wisp here, now I can actually cast here and hit all three enemies, because this will actually spread out in a line size of 5 across like that. And that makes it super convenient, because now I can just cast right there and hit all 3 enemies. So, there's Moonbeam, pretty cool spell. One of your longest range spells for sure. Next is the Light Sword, which I'll show you is pretty cool if you, let's say for example I need 2 lifesteal. So this spell actually costs 100 QB and 2 AP, but it'll deal damage twice. It deals at 48 damage twice, meaning it actually deals 96 base damage for the 2 AP, and you also steal 30% of the damage you inflict per rune that you have. So let's say, for example, I'm going to go ahead and get all 4 runes, and now I'm going to go ahead and hit him with Light Sword. See how much I just lifestealed off of each of those hits? Now, of course, these are low health or low resist targets, so it's not like real damage, but, you know, you could see how dealing a lot of damage with this Light Sword actually makes it really good for stealing HP. And also, it looks really cool. Next is this spell, Shining Orbs, which I think is one of the weird spells that, it got nerfed, but it's still pretty good, I suppose. I say it got nerfed. Really, what got nerfed was stacking 2 wisps on the same square. So essentially what this spell does, it just hits twice. It does pretty good base damage. It costs a lot of QB. If you cast it on an ally, it actually heals them. And, in fact, you can actually cast it on a wisp to increase the AoE to a little cross size, and this actually heals yourself when you cast it in that AoE, so you can actually deal damage while healing yourself, which is pretty good. You also get some Abundance. Now, if you don't know what Abundance is, because I haven't explained it yet, this is the only light spell that actually generates any Abundance. The only other ways to generate Abundance is with passives. So Abundance will actually go up to 100, and gives you bonus damage and healing on your next light spell. So, for example, I'm going to go ahead and get some runes, just a few. If I cast the Shining Orbs here, that will actually give me 30 Abundance, because it gives 10 Abundance per rune possessed. And now if I go ahead and cast this again, it's going to consume the 30 Abundance to heal more and deal extra damage. As you can see, I did more damage. And then it gave me more Abundance because I casted it again. So that will apply at the end of the cast, as you can see here. Then my next light spell would deal extra damage. And you just, you know, you can use this to do a little extra damage, a little extra healing. Okay, so that's cool. That's Shining Orbs. Next is Glistening Halo. Now, this is a spell that actually got nerfed really hard. I don't know anybody still using it, but let me go ahead and show you what it does anyway. So it's really complicated, right? You can actually place these halos on enemies and allies, but not summons. I don't know why they necessarily made it for summons, but it's fine. Can't use it on summons. So the mark itself, I mean, you can't even see it, but when it goes off, it'll explode and do a little square AoE. Now, there's a few ways to can actually trigger the Halo explosion. One of them is to cast it right again on the same target again, and that actually can actually see how it creates the AoE. Another way is to have an error rune when you place the first Halo. Another way is if the target with the Halo dies. And the last way is if it gets hit by a different Halo explosion. So, for example, if I use this here, that actually triggers all 3 Halos to go off at the same time. Now, you can actually place as many as you want, but I heard there's a bug where you can only cast a certain amount of Halos, or a certain amount of hits per Halo. So, you just want to keep that in mind. It got nerfed pretty hard. The last patch, they nerfed the crap out of it, so I don't really use it. Now that I've gone through all of the elemental spells, I'm going to go ahead and show you some of these neutral spells, which I think are all really cool. Ignore these 3 down here. These are the ones that everyone has. But I'm going to go ahead and show you these. This right here is Solar Stronghold. So Solar Stronghold is not nearly as good as it used to be. It really just gives resistance now. That's kind of it. Along with that, when you take damage, you can actually generate a rune in the element of the damage you took. For example, if you take fire damage, you'll get a fire rune, but it'll consume 50 QB. Now, if you don't have the QB for it to generate that rune, it won't do it. This spell isn't great. You can also cast it on allies, and you'll get the rune for it when they take damage. Again, it's not great. I personally don't use it. Next is Runic Overcharge. It's a really cool spell. You can see the effect it does, where if you have all 4 runes, I'll show you really quick. You actually get this full effect of getting 2 AP, 80 resistance, 2 MP, and a big heal all at the same time. And of course, you can cast this on an ally. You can see how my resistance is now really good. Cast this on an ally, and they get basically really overcharged for 1 turn, which is really fun. And it has a 2-turn cooldown, of course. It's very expensive, costs 200 QB. Next is Wall of Energy. This is a really cool spell. It only costs QB, and the only thing is you can't place it anywhere where you wouldn't be able to get all 3 walls off, but you can see how this works. It actually blocks line of sight. So, for example, I can't cast anything that goes through this wall, but I could cast directly on the wall. But if I wanted to cast through it, I would actually have to stand in it. Now, for enemies, it actually removes MP if they walk into the Wall of Energy, as you can see right here. And it only lasts 1 turn. I mean, it lasts until the end of your next turn, which isn't very useful, because I got my turn, so it's not very useful anymore. Next is Visio Imperium. This spell is really weird. I think a lot of people find it to be only useful as a stabilize. For example, if I get an Earth Rune, I can stabilize anybody I want on a 2-turn cooldown, which is basically the main use of it. On top of that, it also has some weird effects, like, for example, the Air Rune can increase my range. So if you look at my Downpour range, see how I don't really have that much I can reach here. But if I get an Air Rune and cast Visio Imperium, I now have +3 range for 1 turn. I can now reach all the way over here. So that's pretty cool, I guess, right? Of course, if you cast it on an enemy, you can give them -3 range. Then the Water and Fire versions, they give like this weird effect where I can give him level 5 Incurable, so he takes 50% less heals, but it also gives him 50% armor received at the same time. So I don't know how useful that is. I personally will never use this for that effect. Of course, the Water Rune does the opposite. It's level 5 Crumbly plus 50% healing. It's really only for 1v1 fights where you know the enemy, for example, they won't be able to heal, but they armor a lot. You would put Crumbly on them. Or if you think they'll never be able to armor, but they can heal, you'll put Incurable on them. Next is Principe of Valir, which is pretty cool. It has a different effect for each element. So, for example, the Fire Rune, you actually switch places with the target you pick. Now, you're wondering, why would I ever use that when I could use Mirage? Well, the main reason is that you can actually use it at any angle. For example, let's say I wanted to switch like this. That's pretty useful. What else? So, the Air version is really cool. It actually lets you just teleport to whatever square you pick. Super simple. If the last rune you generate is an Earth Rune, you can actually teleport the target to directly in front of you. Now, one thing you'll want to keep in mind is that you can't really pick the cell that they go to. It kind of just goes to wherever you're facing when you cast a spell. So let's say, for example, I wanted to get the target here. Well, casting it is going to turn me around and teleport them here instead. So, not super useful. Another interesting thing that I thought was funny is if you cast this on yourself, I think you just go in front of yourself. So, that's pretty funny. Lastly is the Water one, which I think is probably one of the better ones. You can actually just teleport a target to wherever your closest wisp is, which you'll notice, you know, I could have, let's say I have like another wisp over here. It'll go to the closest wisp. So if I go here, it'll teleport him over there. However, let's say I wanted to get him over here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now it has a max range of 7, you'll see. I can can actually get him right over to that other... Well, he's still a little bit too far away, I think. Go ahead and get rid of those. So now if I do it, this will actually teleport him to that wisp. That's super good for, like, precise positioning. Like, if you want to get someone over to a very specific cell, that's really good. Because then I can pick up my wisp. There's actually a passive that increases the wisp range too, which I'll point out in a second. Last one is Runification. This one actually just gives you DI for each rune that you have currently, and consumes them. So this will actually give me 40 DI for the rest of this turn, which I wish it lasted longer than that, but it doesn't. So, but you know, you could potentially make some use out of that. I personally don't use it. So now let me go ahead and show you some of the passives, or all of the passives, I suppose. So, passives. Okay, there's a lot of them. So, let me start with Dynamo. Dynamo is really cool. You will actually, when you generate a rune, you'll actually get 1 AP back when you generate that rune. So this is a passive. I always use this passive. You can see how I get an AP back every single time I generate a new rune. I generated all 4 runes with just 4 AP. The only downside is that these runes only last for 1 turn instead of the 2 turns they were lasting before. Now, I personally like that because it makes it easier to generate my my new next rune generated, or last rune generated. For example, let's say if I don't have this passive, you know, let's just say, for example, I don't have this passive. Well, let's say I generate an air rune, and I pass my turn. Well, now, what if I wanted to, for example, what if I wanted to get another air rune? So let's say I make a fire rune. Well, now I want to get another air rune, because I want my last rune generated to be air, so I can do the teleport on Principio Valir. Well, if I do this to try to get an air rune, it doesn't make my new air rune. So what's annoying about not having this passive is that the runes last 2 turns, which can be really inconvenient. With Dynamo, that's not the case. Next passive is Antithesis, which is really cool. I'll show you that with this passive, you actually generate 20 QB every time you make a rune, but you lose a little bit of damage on those spells. So for example, you can see, well, let me go ahead and consume all my QB really quick by doing this. Now, whenever I generate a rune, you'll see that I actually get 20 QB. This is really convenient because as you play, you'll be generating a lot of runes, and I can guarantee you that you'll be generating so many runes that you'll probably really appreciate this passive in the long run. Next passive is Elemental Distension. I personally don't like this passive that much. It just increases the range of your elemental spell that you pick of the heart by 2. So, for example, if I go into Water Heart, see, I can't reach with Downpour, but if I go into Water Heart, now I can reach suddenly. I mean, it's fine, I guess. It also increases the range of spells that aren't modifiable. For example, look at Walloping. It has a 1 to 3 range that's not modifiable, but I can cast it from here. So that's, I suppose, could be useful, especially considering it has no downside. I think that's the only reason to take this passive, is if you don't have anything else to pick and you don't want a downside. Next is Light Link, which is a really cool passive. I think it's one of my favorites. So let me go ahead and read what this passive does. You actually switch places with the Will-O-Wisp when you summon it. So let me show you. So let's say I go ahead and summon a Will-O-Wisp. Well, now I'm over here. So if you think that this passive is a free teleport every turn, you would be correct. Look at my AP. It's 12. Teleport 3 cells. 12 AP, and you can do that every single turn. This is kind of funny, especially considering it goes through targets, so look at that. Like, that's so good. I think every Huppermage will probably end up using this passive. What's important about these passives, by the way, is that they all change how you play. You don't have to take every single passive, and in fact, there are only a very few amount of passives that are actually good on every playstyle, in my opinion. So for example, if I pick Fullness, this actually will change how my Will-O-Wisp works. So when I pick up my Will-O-Wisp, I won't get a rune anymore, but I'll get Abundance. So if you remember what Abundance is, that's that state. So for example, I put the Water rune down, now I pick it up. Well, I don't get the Water rune, but I did get this 25 Abundance for my next Light spell. I personally don't like that passive because I like getting that rune. I think the rune is just too valuable. Universality is really cool. This is the passive that when you end your turn, depending on which runes you have, you get a bonus. You can actually get all 4 of these bonuses, which if you're thinking, you know, getting 15 DI, 15 heals, 75 resist, and 2 range from one passive is really good, you'd be correct. This is a very good passive. It's just, it gets kind of expensive. You lose a lot of QB per rune possessed. So for example, let's say I want to get all 4 of those bonuses. I can generate all 4 runes. When I end my turn, Universality is going to give me all 4 of those bonuses, but I lost 200 QB for it. Now, what's cool about this is I'll actually go ahead and show you. You don't actually need all the QB to get that bonus. See how I end, my QB goes down to basically 0, but I still got the bonuses. And if I do it again, I'll get the bonuses again. So if you're willing to be without QB, you can actually keep all 4 bonuses or whatever bonuses you want as much as you want. Now, personally, whenever I use this passive, I usually just try to stick with these 2 bonuses. That's the resistance, 75 resistance, and 15 DI. Sometimes I'll just have one of those 2 instead of both. For example, I might just end with an Earth Rune, just so I can get that resistance. So that's that passive. I really like that. Next, I'm gonna show you Sense Extension. Now, if you misread this passive name as Sen Sextension, I would not blame you. I think they really need to add like a hyphen here or something, but it's Sense Extension. Now this passive I think it's cool. I think everyone uses it because you get double QB, but the heart also lasts 2 turns. It's weird because they make it sound like this is a downside, but the heart lasts longer. But really, it doesn't really feel like a downside if you actually play with it, because this way you can stay in heart all the time. So see how I start my turn, I'm still in heart? Well, now I could go into fire heart, and now I start my turn and I'm still in fire heart. The other thing is, now all my QB generation is doubled. So if I show you some QB generation, watch this. So when I do that, when I generate this rune, instead of getting 20 QB back, I actually get 40 back, which I think is kind of funny that it's basically got 2 upsides. I don't know if I would necessarily call it 2 upsides, but it definitely sort of feels like one, doesn't it? I'll explain one situation where you might not use this passive, but I'll explain that in the future. Rune of Profusion is really cool. I think a lot of people use this just for abundance stacking. So the way this passive works is when you end your turn, you actually get 15 abundance per rune you possess. The downside is, of course, you lose QB generation by 20%. So for example, if I end with all 4 runes, I now have 60 abundance. So this is really good, especially if you can combine it with Light Arrow. You can actually get that abundance and then use it up on Light Arrow to get like a really good burst turn in. Next is going to be Quadrimental Absorption, which is really cool. This is actually the only passive you have which gives you Force of Will. It's actually going to give you extra 20 QB whenever you perform an AP, MP, or range reduction, but you lose 10% DI in your light spells. So let's say, for example, I want to generate some QB using that. Let me generate a rune. So I've got my... Let's go ahead and get my runes. So if I go ahead and try to remove some AP and MP here, you'll see I actually got 40 QB just by hitting him with that, and I'll do it again. I get 40 more QB from just removing some AP and MP off of it. So that's pretty good, especially considering Force of Will improves your chances of removing those AP and MP. Next is Elemental Refraction. This is the worst passive I have ever seen in a video game, ever. So this passive increases your Heart of Light cast to 4 times per turn, but you lose that precious Elemental Mastery bonus that you get when you're in Heart of Light. I personally don't understand why you'd ever want to do this. I mean, okay, so you can switch hearts, but you lose... Look how much mastery I lost. I lost 1,000 mastery. I don't really think it's that important to switch hearts this often. I really don't. So I'm hoping they replace this passive with something else. And just look how useless this is. Like, what's the point of this if I lose all that mastery, really? So don't use this passive, please. Please don't use this passive. Next, medicine's actually really good if you go with a healing build. So for example, if you do Soul Altruism in medicine, Soul Altruism will actually replace the 30 DI you get with 30 heals performed. I'm not even going to show this, but basically you can assume that you get some really good heals. When I do a healer Huppermage, these two passives are basically required. Next is New Breath. Now I'm actually going to show you this passive really quick. So what this passive does is it actually increases the Will-O-Wisp range by 3. So that was me mentioning earlier that the Will-O-Wisp range can be increased. When you cast it, if there's already a Will-O-Wisp out, you actually move the previous Will-O-Wisp. So now you can only have one Will-O-Wisp at a time. So let me show you what that looks like. Let's say I want to put a Will-O-Wisp over here. Okay, but now I want to move it over here. There you go. You can actually move your Will-O-Wisp around wherever you want, but you can only have one at a time. Now, if you're wondering if this is useful, I personally think it's pretty useful because I could move it there, cast some spells on the Will-O-Wisp, and then pick it up. Now, the main usage for this passive is actually a combination with Light Link. This is the passive that allows you to switch with the Will-O-Wisp. You can probably see where I'm going with this. Let me show you how amazing this mobility is. Now I can literally teleport 6 cells for free every single turn. If you think that's broken, it kind of is. Just look at that. I can do that every turn, and I can go through targets. This is what makes Huppermage good, by the way. Like, it's got to be one of the most mobile classes in the game. Like, this is the cheapest mobility, traveling 6 cells for free, no line of sight every turn. Of course, you lose out on the upside of having wisps and, you know, generating runes, saving runes for later, stuff like that. But that's super good, and I personally use that pretty much every fight. Next is Soul Development. This is an okay passive, I suppose. You get an extra 100 resistance in all elements except for the one you picked, which, when you're in Heart, you actually lose 100 resistance in that Heart. And the other downside is you actually lose half the bonus mastery, so let me go ahead and show you. So if you look at my resistance, I'm actually at 87, but if I go into Water Heart, it's actually going to bump all of my resistances up to 89%, with the exception of my water resist, which goes down by 100, down from 87% down to 84%. The other downside, of course, like I mentioned, is I lose some of that mastery. So instead of having 6,000, I now have 5,500. I personally do not like that passive, and I won't use it for anything. Pulsation's funny. I'll show it really quick. It's not very useful, unfortunately. It's cool. This is one of those passives that's... It like, hits the nail on the head when it comes to like a cool passive, but it's also one of the most useless passives I've ever seen. So when you summon a Will-O-Wisp, it attracts aligned targets within 5 cells by 2 cells, and when you recover the Will-O-Wisp, it repels aligned targets within 5 cells by 2 cells. So for example, I could do this, which pulls him in, and then do this, which pushes us both away. You could maybe make some use out of this. I mean, I don't know. I personally don't think it's useful anymore. It used to be useful back when you could stack 2 wisps on the same square. You would pull everything in by 4 cells, basically, and then hit them with the shiny orbs, but they actually removed that from the game. So I personally would not use this passive anymore. Carnage is really good if you don't care about healing, so you might want to use that. Runic Save is okay. I see a lot of people using this passive, especially like newer Huppermages, I think, get baited into using this passive, but unfortunately, it's not actually that good. So you get to basically, when you have 1 rune, you can actually Will-O-Wisp to summon 3 runes onto that Will-O-Wisp, but the spell becomes 1 use per turn, and that's the big downside, which makes this passive, I think, personally useless. See how I can get 3 runes? But now what am I going to do? Next turn I pick them up, sure, and I get 3 runes, but it's just, I don't know if that's useful or not. I mean, and let me show you something else that I don't like about it. If you're thinking about combining this with Dynamo, this passive, Dynamo only gives you AP back. It doesn't give you maximum AP. So if I cast this, if you think I'm going to go up to a bunch of AP, I only go up to 14. And you can see I got +0 and +0 here. So when you do this, you have to make sure that you've already used up some AP. So let's say, for example, I cast a few of these. Well, hold on. Let's say, for example, I cast a few of these. Well, now I'm going to go from 7 AP up to 11. See how I got 5 AP back from casting that 1 AP spell? That is actually pretty good. I'll admit that if you don't mind basically limiting your Will-O-Wisp to 1 cast per turn, you might want to consider trying to use this passive, but I personally don't like it, and I think a lot of Hupper mages, the more they try using it, I think are going to decide the same thing. Next, I'm going to talk about a Soul Initiative. This is probably my least favorite passive that they added. It's a very baity passive, so you're essentially looking at if your first spell cast during your turn is Heart of Light, you get 2 AP. Sounds good, right? But you also don't generate runes with elemental spells when you're in Heart of Light anymore. So let me go ahead and show you. First things first, you cannot benefit from this passive on the first turn. So for a passive that's called Soul Initiative, that has the word initiative in it, it's not good it's not good for the first turn. In fact, it does nothing for the first turn, except maybe make it impossible for you to generate runes while in your heart. So it's literally worse than not having the passive on turn 1. Next thing is, so let's say you just, you do it. So, okay, well now I get that extra 2 AP, that's nice. But, let's say, for example, I needed to generate more runes. So, for example, I want to do, let's say, Glistening Tears. Well, I might go into Waterheart at the start of next turn. I'll do my Glistening Tear. But now if I cast Downpour, I'm not going to get the rune for it. So if I want to generate QB from my Aquatic Heart, because if I do this and then cast Glistening Tear, it's not going to give me any QB back because the last spell I cast wasn't an elemental spell. So, I mean, I don't know, like, I guess it's sort of useful, but I don't know if that extra 2 AP is really worth it. I suppose there could be some use to this, and I actually think, let me show you something I thought of. For example, any combination of spells that don't really require a current rune, maybe Twilight Beam. So let's say, for example, I'm going to get the Fire Rune and end my turn. I'm going to just go ahead and go right into this just to get the Fire Rune. I'm going to cast Twilight Beam. Now I'm going to cycle to get my Fire Rune back and cast it again. And then I could cycle one more time and hit one more person with one other person with a Twilight Beam. And essentially do that every turn. See what I'm saying? Like, this could be an option for you every single turn. I don't know how useful that is. Who knows? I wonder if there's anybody who's going to try using that. This passive is actually not a good combination, unfortunately, with Sense Extension, because you would essentially have to switch different hearts every single turn, because you can't go back into the same heart you're already in. So, Elemental Combination. This is an interesting passive. I actually kind of like it, and I think in some fights I take it just for the sake of having the option to generate a lot of abundance. So when you generate a Nemesis rune based on the last rune generated, you actually get 15 abundance. However, your abundance is capped at 60. So let's say, for example, I have a water rune. If I just use Cycle, that's going to give me a fire rune and give me this abundance. Now I can cast this and get another 15 abundance. Now I can cast Earth, switch it to Air, 45 abundance, and now I cast Earth again, 60 abundance. So just like that, I got 60 abundance. If I use this with, let's say, for example, I used it with, let's see, I might use it with a Dynamo and Antithesis. So I could, okay, get the Water Rune, switch it to Fire, get the Water Rune again, okay, get an Earth Rune, switch it to Air, get an Earth Rune again, and now I've got 60 abundance and 6 AP, and I can now Light Arrow, and that's actually a pretty good combination just for like turn 1. Light Arrow. You get the Abundance, you do some pretty good damage with Light Arrow on turn 1. That could be an option for you if you want to do just like turn 1 burst kind of damage. Last passive I want to show is Runic Transcendence. I think a lot of people give this passive a lot of flack for being just not that good, but I personally don't think it's that bad. So what the passive does is it doubles your QB generation if you have all 4 runes. Otherwise, your QB gains are halved. So, for example, let me go ahead and use up my QB really quick. So I'm going to go ahead and show you that with, when I generate QB, let's say an Earth Heart, instead of getting 20, I mean, I actually get 10. That's not very good, is it? However, what I will say is, if you don't mind getting all 4 runes, like let's say there's a turn where I want to get a bunch of QB, you know, whatever, I might just get all 4 runes, and then start hitting them with an expensive spell like this spell. See how I get so much QB back. Now you're thinking, well, you're only getting 60 and spending 100. Well, if I combine this with Sense Extension, this is that passive that also doubles generation of QB. Now you've got 2 things that double QB generation. And so, for example, if I get all 4 runes and use Shiny Orbs, I now get 120 QB back while only spending 100. See, that actually went up in QB when I cast that. Or if I cast Light Sword, this will spend 100 QB and get 80 back. So that's actually not bad. See? That's just something you could do. I personally don't really like it that much, but that's just because you have to get all 4 runes. Any turn where you want to get all 4 runes, though, I suppose this could be useful with Shiny Orbs or something like that. I personally won't use it. So that's all the passives. If you want to quick see what a Huppermage would look like in action, I actually uploaded an earlier video where I played through the Sophokia Rift by myself at max level and placed decently high on the leaderboard. I think I got 3rd place. So if you want to see Huppermage in action, go ahead and check that out. And I will see you guys next time. Thank you.